The TNT Shop has great gift ideas for your furry family member. And we don't mean your Aunt Dolores.
You stink!
The TNT Shop has it all at TNTRadio.live. Patrick Henningsen talks on today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
And welcome back to the Patrick Henningsen Show with me, Basil Valentine, in for Patrick today, Monday, the 26th of February, 2024. I'm delighted to say I'm joined from Belgrade in Serbia by the one and only Kit Klarenberg, Britain's foremost journalist on the machinations of the United Kingdom national security state, which has been in overdrive in the last week or so, turning peaceful protesters outside the House of Commons into some kind of Islamist terror threat. It really has been quite bizarre stuff, according to the former Home Secretary Suella Braverman. The United Kingdom is now effectively run by Islamist extremists, but it was, of course, the flag of Israel that was projected all over number 10 Downing Street shortly after October the 7th. Meanwhile, projections on the House of Commons last week calling for a ceasefire have somehow been derided as anti-Semitic. We really are in a dystopian world. And as you know, Kit, anything like this invariably tends to lead to a crackdown. Somehow ministers, all politicians, MPs are at threat from peaceful protesters, from grannies and people pushing strollers and all the rest of it. And that means that protest must be curtailed and so on and so forth. It's such a familiar playbook, isn't it, Kit?
Actually taking a bit of a break following my removal from Twitter. So, I mean, I was rather enjoying and like not having to constantly look at like photos of mutilated Palestinian children in my Twitter feed. I mean, that was a welcome relief. But at the same time, my eyes were glued to what was occurring in the United Kingdom, which was somehow almost as disturbing and frightening. I mean, the sight of multiple Israel flags being flown in the House of Commons. I mean, as someone who studied British politics at university, this is unimaginable. I mean, this is complete, and I would very sadly watch parliamentary debates regularly and prime minister's question. The idea that chamber would ever feature a foreign country's flag, but let alone Israel's, while it's committing a genocide, as per the findings of the International Court of Justice, and also Keir Starmer openly admitting that he was speaking to Zionist operatives before he sabotaged the SNP's vote for to back a ceasefire in Gaza. Before he sabotaged the SNP's vote for to back a ceasefire in Gaza. The projections on Downing Street and the House of Commons. It's really remarkable. And I think that we are hurtling very, very, very quickly all over the Western world to just avert brazen forms of totalitarianism, because the perceptive and media unity of the war around the war in Ukraine, this is evil, unprovoked war of aggression by a Hitler-esque tyrant for no reason other than his own Machiavellian bloodlust. That has largely remained unchallenged for the best part of 2 years, although it is rapidly collapsing. Whereas the entire world, with some ignoble exceptions, is standing with the Palestinians and ever more aggressively. And we see this all over according to polls in Europe, the populations overwhelmingly oppose what Israel is doing. They overwhelmingly see this as genocide. They overwhelmingly want their governments to do whatever they can to stop it, and governments are just are carrying on and doing it. And their only response to their only way of managing the narrative is to criminalize Palestine solidarity. If and when Keir Starmer becomes the next prime minister, and a law criminalizing anti-Zionism is probably going to be the top of his agenda, the first thing that he does when he gets into office. I would imagine that this is exactly the same is true in a large number of other European countries, because power has no answer. They are dedicated to maintaining the settler colonial project in Palestine. They are a genocide of varying speeds. It by necessity perpetuates. So yeah, a worrying time all round indeed. But as Norman Finkelstein states, rational hope does spring eternal. We see this manifested in the continuing, enduring defiance of Yemen, Ansar Allah, love you Yemen, my new favorite country on earth, who are refusing to back down, who continue to throw down gauntlets for the US and Britain and their Zionist bastard offspring. It's really quite remarkable. And we see almost every day the US empire starting to disintegrate, gradually then rapidly. Their ability to act as a military force almost anywhere in the world is now questionable. I saw someone on Twitter not long before I was banned it posted a map of US bases in West Asia and said what previously looked like a kind of threatening map of potential Death Stars throughout the region now rather resembles a bunch of juicy, easy targets. I mean, I personally am committed to pacifism and non-violence. I must stress that, but I say this from a position of relative privilege. If I grew up in an open-air concentration camp like Gaza, and my family and friends were systematically slaughtered for the sick amusement of psychopaths, I might have a rather different perspective on things.
It is indeed the sick amusement of psychopaths, and if we can put up the image of the red dress on front of the armored car. I don't know if you saw that on X today. I mean, another picture of an IDF soldier, I hate to use the word proudly, displaying a pair of high-heeled shoes he had looted from a Palestinian home he'd just destroyed, and then he was declaring he was going to give to his wife. I mean, the sadism, cruelty, a total lack of self-awareness of some of these Israeli soldiers is absolutely off the charts. And when you contrast that with, as you say, the image of Israeli flags all over the House of Commons, this is, dystopic beyond all measure. We didn't think even a year or two ago we would witness such things. I saw that image of the Israeli flags in the House of Commons, and I didn't think it was real, Kit. I scrolled past it quite quickly. I thought it must have been somebody has drawn that on to illustrate the extent to which Israel dominates the House of Commons, and those flags they weren't actually physically there. They've been matted on since in a Photoshop to indicate where pro-Israel MPs sit or something. I didn't think it had actually happened.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because it's like, I mean, it is a real pity that this is coming at the cost of, I think it was something like 120 dead children a day on average, or something horrific. But I do think this is a major sea change in global opinion, particularly in the Western world. I think that there's no coming back. There's no going back to the pre-October October 7th time. Israel. In 2014, I played a small role in helping organise protests in solidarity with the Palestinians during Operation Cast Lead, which was a carpet bombing of Gaza, they were vastly attended, but we were spat at and had stuff thrown at us in the street, and we also had evil people like Douglas Murray, who of course is in and out of Tel Aviv a lot at the moment. One of many Z-list celebrities the Zionists have gotten in to try and whitewash their genocide. I saw Haaretz complaining the other day about the fact that Michelin restaurant critics will no longer visit Israel. One of the many downsides of committing a 21st century Holocaust. But I just think that there's no going back. The ICJ has effectively ruled that what Israel is doing is not self-defense. The protests, the Palestine solidarity process are so vast and so dignified that they cannot be libeled by people like Douglas Murray as a bunch of immigrants, causing trouble, potentially being directed by foreign powers. No, like this is visceral and real, and what we are that US soldier who set himself on fire in protest of the Gaza genocide. His last Facebook post said, a lot of people wonder, what they would have done during slavery and during Jim Crow. Well, what you're doing now is a guide to what you would have done then, because there's no both sides in this. And I mean, much as the mainstream media does still try and get their guests to say, well, do you condemn Hamas? Straight off. As much as they're still trying to breathe life into that corpse, no. This is a point where a large number of people are asking themselves, are we the baddies? In the spirit of Mitchell and Webb when they dress up as Nazis, because it's a kind of similar. It's a similar thing in Ukraine as well, where it's like now it is the narrative, as I say, is starting to collapse spectacularly. People are asking questions about whether it was sensible and whether we were on the right side of history to be backing a country with a vast profusion of open Nazis in their armed forces, and whether it was really sensible to be flooding that country with all sorts of weapons and giving them military training, and whether we might have done something to provoke what has happened. I don't think we're necessarily there yet in respect of Ukraine. Maybe we won't get there, but in Gaza, absolutely. And so, as I say, rational hope springs eternal. And as again, as depressing as it is, I think the National Security Act, which I wrote about just before I got banned on Twitter, it's a frightening bit of legislation which creates all sorts of new offences, and that are so broad that people will, almost inevitably, by definition, break the law without knowing, without wanting to, without intending to, without having any cognizance that they are doing something legal. There will be test cases, there will be show trials. I'm sure that I'm probably a top candidate for an initial test run to be prosecuted under this. But at the same time, this is the sign of weakness. They know that they can't allow a genuinely free media and genuine free speech to proliferate, because far too many people will ask the wrong questions or draw the quote unquote wrong conclusions. Lloyd George, in that well-known fan of Adolf Hitler, in his diary during the First World War, he stated rather starkly, if the reality of the front line was known by the public, the war would end tomorrow. Therefore, they can't know and they won't know. And it's the same. The same ethos applies now, where it's like, if people, the overwhelming majority of Western citizens, if they knew what their governments were actually doing at home and abroad, there would be palace revolutions. So better criminalize it first, eh? So I would say that in the short term, at least, this is a really troubling development, and I have urged many of my friends and comrades in the UK who are engaged in Palestine solidarity activism to get out while you still can, because that's it seems sensible. But I think this is the end of it, right? Like this is the sign that the British state and the British kind of neo empire, they know that their days are numbered. and then they therefore cannot abide the slightest criticism or even ridicule. So a longer term view is more optimistic than a short term one. It's just a shame we have to live in the short term, isn't it?
Yes, and as John Maynard Keynes said, in the long run, we're all dead. But before then, I think, we are on the verge of a political earthquake. I think George Galloway is almost certain to win in Rochdale. Admittedly, that's only one seat in Parliament, a by-election. I would imagine he'll probably hold it at the general election. There's deeper dissatisfaction with British politics than at any time in my lifetime. I think 3/4 of people do not like either the Conservative or Labour parties at the moment, and quite rightly, if for no other reason that both are complicit and fully on board with the genocide. We're going to take a very short break with the network. When we come back, I want to get into more detail about the so-called National Security Act, when, if at all, it will become law, whether or not we can expect any pushback from the so-called House of Lords, and what exactly it is we'll be criminalising. Can I expect my door to be kicked in while making a broadcast like this? We'll be right back after this short break.
Don't tempt them.
TNT's Tyler Nixon.
I think with the people behind her, the never Trumpers and the money flowing in, whatever their end game is, it doesn't seem that she'll be dropping out even if she loses her own state, which kind of gives you a sense of the arrogance of power of people who back the Nikki Haleys of the world, where the popular support, popular consent doesn't really mean anything to them. They're gonna continue forward seeking that power, putting themselves in the mix, regardless of how many spankings or smackdowns they get from the citizens, from the electorate, who are obviously minor, just a sort of a speed bump in the path in the quest for power.
Tyler Nixon on today's News Talk.
At the top of the hour, we'll keep on top of the news.
It's the most important thing we can do.
On today's News Talk, TNT Radio.
And welcome back to the Patrick Henningsen Show with me, Basil Valentine, in for Patrick today, Monday, the 26th of February. Liz Truss has apparently told Steve Bannon that a radical Islamic party could win the Rochdale by-election. And then she said nothing at all when Bannon described Tommy Robinson as a hero. I mean, honestly, that woman was Prime Minister of Great Britain briefly, Kit. And she's describing the Workers' Party of Britain, a left party opposed to genocide and fronted by a Scotsman with the support of the only other person I can think of, prominent person is Chris Williamson, that now belongs to the Workers' Party of Great Britain, former Labour MP. She described it as a radical Islamic party. Now, this all comes from that nonsense last week, that really sinister nonsense, which I think comes straight out of the Tel Aviv playbook, that somehow opposition to genocide is associated with radical Islam. I mean, it's just off the charts, bonkers, batshit crazy garbage.
Yeah, I mean, oh yes, I mean, as someone who has been now, I was removed from Twitter because I was mass reported because I suggested that some footage of an interview of two Jewish Israeli women who were held hostage by Hamas and seemed to have really rather enjoyed the experience and claimed that they were treated as sacred and queens, and they had jolly arm wrestling bouts with their captors, and indeed. They were avowedly worried that the Israelis might rescue them at any moment. It's a rather strange concern to have if you're being held in awful conditions by a terrorist group. I suggested that such was the looks on their faces and the tones of their voices that they had met real men for the first time in their lives, and this was mutated into me advocating for mass rape. I mean, by the Zionists, as the rather wonderful Jewish comedian Alexei Sale is fond of saying, Zionists lie and they lie and they lie because it's what they do and what they have to do. to maintain their lies. So, and rather fittingly, we've now had the New York Times yet again be forced to issue a major mea culpa, because it turns out that a story about alleged Hamas sexual atrocities turned out that one of the authors was a former Israeli intelligence operative who had been sharing and amplifying and liking all sorts of posts on social media advocating for genocide of Palestinians, who had no journalistic background. I mean, this has happened quite a lot since October 7th, hasn't it? I mean, we were told that Hamas had slaughtered 1,400 people in cold blood, and then this was revised down to 1,200, and then it was revised down again to just about 600. And it turns out that Israel did most of the killing, but they refused to have official public investigations into this because it would be unseemly, and it might undermine confidence in the Israeli occupation forces. So, I mean, it's really quite astonishing. I know Chris and George personally. I think that they're ace, and yes, I totally agree. I think that George will almost inevitably win that by-election. It would be good to see more people signing up to the Workers' Party. It would be good to see more people actually thinking of completely jettisoning the Labour Party, because I mean, it's beyond joke now. As I say, I think we're in this position where elites feel that they can just get away with anything, that they're just completely openly brazen about lying, about manipulating people, and about their just total hypocrisy and lack of respect for the law. I mean, we've recently had a spate of German officials who've admitted that the sanctions failed, and we probably should have known they were always going to fail, but hey, what can you do? And then, meanwhile, Germany's economy is collapsing. Politically, they're in like a really, really bad place. The far right is taking off everywhere. Were we always just living in a totalitarian system without really realizing it because of the rainbow flags? I'm not so sure, but we are certainly in a new reality in many ways. It would be ace if after the next election there isn't a Labour government, but there is in fact a number of other parties which are not signed up to the Zionist genocide project represented in Parliament. I mean, of course, as we've seen what happened with Jeremy Corbyn, I strongly suspect that the MI5 and MI6 and the British military might not respond well to that, which then raises the obvious question of, again, are we really the baddies? Whose side are the people who are meant to protect us ostensibly on?
Yes, I mean, I think the last time we had a genuine dichotomy in British politics was in the early mid-1970s. I don't think Harold Wilson was completely controlled, and hence there was the famous plot against him. Since then, since the election of Thatcher, who was basically a neoliberal wrecking ball, something of an imbecile who was allowed to enact all these anti-union policies and privatization. Since then, the national security state haven't really wanted to take the chance of somebody that they hadn't approved of and or didn't fully control taking power. Hence, John Smith was summarily dispatched and Tony Blair installed as Prime Minister instead. And the rest, as they say, is history. Although he was allowed to carry on living, Jeremy Corbyn was politically assassinated to the extent that absolutely disgraceful individual masquerading as Archbishop of Canterbury refused to share a platform with Pastor Munter meet Pastor Munter because he'd shared a platform with Jeremy Corbyn. I mean, this is just absolutely off the chart stuff, but it's indicative of the extent to which the cancer of Zionism has infiltrated the body politic in Britain. I mean, the idea, they memory hold the footage very quickly, that Starmer went to ring Isaac Herzog, the president of Israel, who was at the security conference in Munich, to get his instructions about how to amend the SNP ceasefire motion, and then get the very ready agreement of Lindsay Hoyle, also a member of the Labour Friends of Israel, to prevent any kind of meaningful motion being put before the House of Commons. I mean, this is just absolutely disgraceful stuff. Now, what I want to know is, under this new National Security Act, criticising the government is going to become, if not a criminal offence, well, you better choose your words carefully, because you could find yourself falling foul of the law by being too harsh with the words you use, or discovering things that they don't want you discovering. Can you enlighten me, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So, okay, I mean, I think that just to preface this, right? So, I was rather famously or infamously stopped and detained and interrogated for the best part of 6 hours by counter-terrorism police when I flew back into the UK to visit an ailing relative. There were police waiting for me on the runway as I got off. I mean, that's never happened before. And the legislation I was held under is called the 2019 Counter-Terrorism and Border Act, and it was slammed by the UN for creating all sorts of thought crime offences and criminalising free speech. And in effect, the wording of the legislation is just a kind of Orwellian masterclass. So it specifically states that you can be carrying out hostile acts on behalf of a hostile foreign power without you or the foreign power knowing. Now, I said this sentence many times.
I'm not sure how that one works. I mean, that's like saying, you can be stealing something without having known you've stolen it, or the shopkeeper being aware of the fact it's disappeared. It's sort of like,
but it just. It's completely sorry. I didn't mean to cut you off, friend, but it's just it's completely insane, and it effectively creates suspicionless offences. So anyone could plausibly be suspected for any reason being engaged in hostile acts against the UK, and the hostile acts are whatever the British government and security and intelligence services decide they are. Now, I mention this because at the same time that I was stopped, the National Security Act, which was then just the National Security Bill, was going through Parliament, and it contains a lot of very similar language. Excuse me. A lot of very similar vagueness, total lack of imprecision, and as sweepingly broad definitions and powers that, yes, mean almost inevitably people are going to break this law without wanting to. So to give you one example, there is a passage which states that it creates a new offence of receiving a material benefit from a hostile foreign power or intelligence agency. Now, this could be almost anything. And under the terms of the law, it's not necessary for authorities to prove that you received a particular benefit, quote unquote, for committing a certain act. Now, again, this is rather impenetrable, but what it actually means is that, let's say, in a worst case scenario, there is an anonymous social media account run by a hostile foreign power, whichever country the US or the UK government has decided is hostile, and it publishes, say, a hacked document, and then therefore, under the National Security Act, receiving a material benefit can include information. So just by looking at this tweet, they could argue, and I mean, I'm sure that they will, whether they'll be successful or not is a different matter, that you received a material benefit by looking at this. You now possess information you didn't have before, because, and it even states at one stage in this terrifying bit of legislation that it's not necessary to prove which particular foreign power or intelligence agency is involved. So again, it's just like, who isn't a potential criminal under this Act's terms? And I might add as well that while this was going through Parliament, there were very few concerns raised by lawmakers Indeed, many lawmakers openly stated, Conservative and Labour, that this law was necessary to criminalize WikiLeaks, to ensure that if an organization like WikiLeaks could have it was formed, that it would be bannable and its staff imprisonable. I think my dear friends at Declassified UK, again, I'm wondering whether they can continue doing their independent investigative journalism on Empire for very much longer. I think they're already kind of skirting the risk of prosecution just by token of their factual reporting. But it creates all sorts of new offences that are so vague, and I can honestly imagine as well that, like, I mean, on the kind of the lack of cognizance that you're conspiring with a hostile foreign power. There is we have heard for many years that particular perspectives online or even inconvenient truths online serve Russian disinformation objectives. So, like, the factual reporting on even homelessness or the effects of fracking. Oh, well, this is furthering Russian talking points or Kremlin disinformation objectives. Now, again, without knowing that you are furthering Russian narratives and interests, you could be accused of that by token of expressing your legitimate opinion online. The penalties involved for falling foul of this are extremely severe. It's like 10 years between 10 years and life for most of these new offences. I mean, and it's really quite astonishing as well that, like, despite the fact that all of these MPs said we want to effectively prevent another WikiLeaks from being possible to exist. There are lawyers for British press associations who said that this law is so terrifying that it will create a chilling effect by token of its existence. So the journalists won't go certain places, they will ignore certain stories because they're just like, well, that's way too hot to handle. We're going to be in too much trouble. Despite this, no mainstream journalist did any work on this at all. And there was zero criticism voiced in legacy media whatsoever. There was some really good work in the independent media. My friend Mohammed Al-Mazi, I probably painted a target on his back by calling him my friend. Sorry about that, mate. But he did some superb reporting for Consortium News and a few other independent outlets on this. And it's well worth looking into, and I would strongly suggest that activists, whether they're independent or part of wider groups and organisations, and indeed independent journalists, need to be looking at this very carefully. Because, I mean, Craig Murray, my friend and comrade, he has spent a large number of months in Switzerland trying to claim asylum because he's being investigated by British police for terrorism offences. He's now back in the UK. I gather he doesn't feel particularly safe there. I don't blame him. In effect, they're going after everyone and anyone now, and I think that, yes, as I say, this kind of marks the final pinnacle of British state control, because they have completely lost control of the narrative. They've lost means of manipulating. Their ability to manipulate people is rather diminished. Their capacity for censorship via typical methods, like via outsourcing it to civil society groups and disinformation experts they secretly fund to say this isn't true and this source can be trusted and this can't. That's waning very rapidly. So the only responsive power is let's jail dissidents. Let's just throw them in jail and try and damage sympathy for them one way or another in advance.
This is really sort of Soviet-esque stuff. I mean, Craig Murray is a former British ambassador, since he's sort of taken up the cudgel of a crusading journalist in the absence of any others. But what possible terrorist offences could he be accused of? All that terrorism legislation that came in the wake of 9/11 on both sides of the Atlantic and across Europe has been used once again, simply to criminalize dissent. We've had this creep between the blurring of the lines between terrorism and so-called extremism, between extremism and challenging establishment narratives. And it's a very deliberate conflation of completely harmless, less than harmless activities. And anybody seeking to do real world harm. Because after 9/11, suddenly we had this thing, terrorism, which had to be eliminated and punished with in the strongest possible censures and, government sledgehammers, whatever. Terrorism, this is all, which interestingly enough is different from the 1980s and 90s, where people accepted that whether it was the ANC or the IRA, we were seeking to make accommodation with even violent people of different persuasions representing different groups, right? Something changed in 2001, and not only was terrorism sort of reclassified as the greatest evil in the world, but also it was conflated with dissent. Simple as that, really.
Yeah.
We're going to take a very short break now. When we come back, I want to get Kit's position on Julian Assange, because this is the test case that will determine a lot of where we're going with this. We'll be right back after this short break.
Patrick Henningsen and TNT.
I was lost for words for a moment back there. And welcome back to the Patrick Henningsen Show with me, Basil Valentine, in for Patrick today, Monday, the 26th of February. Which is the more serious criminal activity? Extrajudicial killings, routine torture of prisoners, and illegal renditions carried out by a state, or exposing those actions by publishing illegally leaked details of how, where, when, and by whom they were committed? This is essentially the question that was asked last week at the Royal Courts of Justice in London. That's Duncan Campbell writing in what is now one of the chief organs of the United Kingdom national security state, The Guardian. I think he's one of the last, if not the last, of the old school Guardian journalists. But The Guardian has been very, 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 very slow and at crucial times completely absent in the whole Assange question. And it'll be interesting. I mean, I'm not a lawyer. Depending on the success or failure of Julian's application for leave to appeal and then subsequent appeal, it may set some precedent which would cut across the National Security Act. Am I right in that supposition, Kit?
Well, very oddly, Duncan Campbell, I is someone who I had an enormous amount of respect for when I was an aspiring journalist. I think that in his more recent years, he seems to have gotten a dose of Russiagate mania, and seems to think that the FSB is lurking under every rock. And excuse me. Although I noticed that he's been reporting on a large number of documents which were allegedly hacked by the FSB, and I'm not sure if he's gotten a knock from the counter-terror police or not on his door. If not, then that's potentially rather strange. But I mean, just more. I think that also as well, he is, as you mentioned, dear Julian, his solidarity with Assange hasn't been as strong as it could be, and I think that's a key litmus test, because a large number of journalists were heavily involved, or we call them journalists, were heavily involved in the wider effort to destroy public sympathy for Assange, which used to be almost universal. It cut across left and right. It cut across different people of every political persuasion and background, economic background, thought that what Julian was doing was superb. So then he was systematically destroyed in the court of public opinion. The independent Australian writer Caitlin Johnson she has a rather wonderful essay where she talks about how a different propaganda narrative for each audience has been created in order to justify his incarceration. So it's a good thing that he's in jail because Russia. It's a good thing he's in jail because Trump. It's a good thing he's in jail. And then when you strip away all the noise, we're just left with it's good that he's in jail. And I think that it's really that leaving aside any question of Julian as a person or or his personality, ultimately he has spent 5 years, his health, mental, physical, deteriorating every single day in a 23-hour lockdown for publishing factual information. He's not a US citizen, but he's an Australian citizen who is being held in a British jail awaiting potential extradition to the US for publishing information the empire doesn't want in the public domain. Again, if you're not outraged and frightened about this, then you are on the wrong side of history. That's just objective. And yeah, so on February 20th and 21st, dear Julian had his last opportunity to potentially to stave off extradition to the US, where he will be held almost inevitably in the most horrific prison conditions imaginable in a supermax prison, which will make his stay in Belmarsh seem like a Disneyland holiday by comparison, or he may even face the death penalty. I mean, this is allegedly due to helping or trying to help unsuccessfully Chelsea Manning crack a password, and this is claimed that he was involved in hacking the US military and the Pentagon. Actually, there seems to have been an effort to try and help Chelsea protect herself from discovery as the leaker, and also to download music. She couldn't do so via the Pentagon's internet. So while she was posted overseas. So yeah, I mean, I'm impossibly reminded as well. Like, we recently had the death of Frank Kitson, who was a scumbag British military official and thinker who in the 1970s created counterinsurgency theory for deployment in Northern Ireland during the quote-unquote Troubles, i.e. the civil war targeting Northern Ireland's Catholic population. And he used analogies like, well, in a counterinsurgency, effectively you're trying to reel in a fish, and the people around them, the general public, are the water in which the fish swims. And in order to flush out the fish, it may be necessary to poison the water entirely. And he also explicitly argued that in a counterinsurgency, the law must be subordinate to the wishes of national security. And in fact, it must be a form of propaganda used for getting rid of unwanted members of the public. Horrific stuff, but hugely influential. And I would suggest, as you say, that we are the counterinsurgency during the War on Terror was fought all over the Middle East and North Africa. Now the counterinsurgencies come home, and we're now living there. I mean, again, I mentioned Declassified UK. Mad respect to them. Thoughts and prayers as well, to an extent. Sadly, they have published a series of articles showing how a large number of judges and lawyers involved in overseeing Assange's extradition and his prosecution after he was sprung from the Ecuadorian embassy, potentially illegally, that they all have conflicts of interest which are very, very, very clear, and they or their wives are part of private security companies, or they represent MI6 and the security services in legal battles. So their vested interest in Julian being sent over to the US and the key to his jail cell very literally thrown away. It couldn't be more unambiguous. I'd actually forgotten about this. I was going over some of the coverage of the hearing in which Assange was jailed for an entire year for breach of bail conditions, which is unprecedented, particularly for someone who does not have a history of violent offences or whatnot. And they never end up in Belmarsh either. The judge said, "Get over to America." The second that Assange was taken into the courtroom. So it's like, I mean, again, it's remarkable that this hasn't caused more outcry. And the reason it hasn't is because there is, as I say, a large number of establishment journalists who kept quiet or justified what was happening to him. James Ball is a particularly notorious repeat offender in this regard, and he is now his journalistic focus is QAnon. Which is to say that James Ball is very keen on that people don't believe the world is run by satanic paedophiles. I wonder why. But another aspect to this was The Guardian, which was used Assange and then threw him under a bus. And I've reported on this in my Substack, that there is a talk that an Australian journalist, award-winning mainstream Australian journalist, gave, where he was talking about how he was shadowing Julian while they were working. I think it was the Afghan war logs, and he overheard a large number of mainstream journalists make comments to the effect of, "It's great because we're not publishing this." So Julian was their fall guy. They had Julian publish all of these sensitive cables, which accounts for some of the charges he's facing now in the US. And they claim that even though they were fully involved in the publication process, they stood back and said, "Oh no, we're just journalists and reporters and we're reporting on the contents. We have nothing to do with this." And the New York Times did this as well. They explicitly, there is footage of Julian on the phone to the New York Times, where the New York Times says, "Can you just publish first? I.e., can you scoop us in effect, and then we'll just report on the material?" And Julian is rather quizzical and perplexed, God bless him, because he doesn't seem to realise that he's been kind of let out on a plank by some extremely unscrupulous, nasty people who pass as journalists in the mainstream. The Guardian was also, it seems, my friend John McAvoy has reported on this, they knew about the extensive UC Global spying operation in the Ecuadorian embassy, and the fact that all of his conversations with lawyers, which are meant to be legally privileged, were being spied upon. He knew the Guardian knew that, yes, that they were going through the trash of the Ecuadorian embassy to work out if the children who were visiting him were his own children. And they just sat on this. They didn't report on it, and it's just. It's baffling to me, and despite that, despite knowing about the spying operation, they also published that dreadful article claiming that what was his name? The Trump advisor. They claimed that Paul Manafort. Sorry, yeah, they claimed that Paul Manafort had visited Julian at the embassy, and then, despite the fact there was this huge outcry from people saying this is true. They then changed the wording slightly. They refused to retract it, even though it says no possible way that it could be true. The journalist who wrote that, Luke Harding, an avowed quote unquote storyteller, makes an enormous amount of money writing absolutely abysmal cash-in books, and it seems was involved in publishing, despite Julian's explicit warnings, the full password to the entire unredacted Cablegate archive. And when that happened, the files were dumped on the web, and Julian got blamed and for putting lives at risk and blah 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 blah. And it's just like it's perverse, actually. And so we shall see. I very sadly do not have very much optimism that he won't be extradited. I think at this stage, the Empire and its assistant manager Britain they have their tail between their legs. They're really struggling in Yemen, and so they just need to flex their muscles to look powerful, like a mafia don. They don't need your protection money, but they're going to break your legs if you haven't got it, because you can't have one person step out of line. So I think that if that day does come, a large number of people should respond by stepping out of line somehow. I would never suggest to your viewers and listeners that people actively break the law. But again, I'm not them. So and from my position of relative privilege, I feel no need to engage in political violence or incendiary regime change activities. Other people's own mileage may vary. So I'm just but it's we shall see. And I think that there was a great quote from Bobby Sands where he said, our victory will be the laughter of our children. Or the Taliban was very fond of saying, you have watches, we have time. Yes, it's sad that we have to be on the front line in the short term, which is going to be very brutal and draconian. But taking a wider picture, I think a better future can be forged, and Julian's example will continue to be an inspiration and motivation for millions of people around the world. If nothing else, that's quite some legacy. It behooves us to follow his example however we can and resist.
Well, I think there'll be a lot of resistance when an attempt is made to physically remove him from the country. It wouldn't surprise me at all if there were, hundreds of people outside Belmarsh physically preventing the security van for departing for Brize Norton or Heathrow or wherever they spirit him away to. I think the logistics will turn sort of theatrical in the extreme and be extremely embarrassing to the United Kingdom and the United States, for that matter. In the last couple of years, the campaign has done an enormous amount to get what one might sort of call the liberal-minded great and the good on his side. It's been a very slow process, but the films, Ithaca and the new film, The Trust Fall, have obviously played their part. There's an exhibition at the moment at the European Parliament as well about the case. There's, and the Australian Parliament voted to bring him back. And finally, I think Albanese is on side with that. So there's a sort of, the remnants of what we used to think of as the liberal wing of the establishment is finally on his side. So if the national security state presses ahead, as it looks like they're going to, and if the judges find against Julian, then the sheer naked authoritarianism of the system we're living under will become even more apparent to people who have previously denied it.
Yeah, well, no, absolutely. And I do think that we're kind of getting to the stage where we're getting to the stage where the empire doesn't, and the forces of oppression, they don't really know how to deal with defiance or people just ignoring them, or indeed they don't realize that and no matter how brazen they may be in their own minds and their sense of impunity, how pervasive that might be, they don't realize how bad this looks to the outside world. And I think that Yemen threw down the gauntlet. They keep on throwing down the gauntlet to the West by doing nothing, pretty much. And they keep scoring effectively flawless victories over the Royal Navy and the US military. The US officials have talked about how they have to spend millions on missiles to shoot down drones that cost a few $1,000s, which are operated by the Yemenis. We should follow their example. Resist.
Kit, we're out of time, so just tell our listeners quickly where they can find you.
Sure, you can find me for the time being on kitklarenberg.com and the Grey Zone UK. Join us.
Great. See
Cheers,
you all
guys.
tomorrow. I'm Basil Valentine. See you tomorrow.